Welcome to the Mono Timelapse tutorial. This session will be going through the second phase of the Auditorium, but this time we'll be running at 4 times speed. We'll be looking at updating the layout, refining the result in Unity, and then adding reflection probes before testing one more time. So after I've got the space in the first phase, then I can sort of get to a client or a colleague in this case and find out what needs to be done to improve. And in this case, we found out a couple of things. So the first thing, the stage was too small, and I think I mentioned that the first one, so I've made that a bit bigger. We also noted that the height of the ceiling could be higher to feel a bit bigger. We also wanted to add a couple of rooms to kind of welcome guests a bit more. So a user would spawn into kind of like a welcome lobby of sorts. Then we might have an area that allows for sort of like a small gallery, so we can use canvases to showcase people's work, and then into the auditorium for any presentations and things like that. So just having a quick look at tweaking the model in order to sort of get those things done, and then cleaning those up once again to keep the poly count as low as possible. As it stands, I'm still trying to figure out which or how many materials I'm going to try and create. At the moment, it's only 2, so the sort of main walls and the glow. But eventually, once I get a better feel for the space, I'll be able to choose if I can get that even lower. So one material using trim sheets or similar styles in order to sort of create a very optimized space overall. So we'll be looking at that as we go. You'll also remember, if you watched all the first one, is getting rid of the polygons on the walls here. So just making sure that you remove all of the polygons that into the stairs, flatten those out, and just have a flat 2D polygon there. So grabbing the one that was there so it's aligned correctly, and then adjusting that as needed. I find the snap tool, like you'll notice there that I added a quick snap to get that polygon up to that one point. Snap tool is super useful for getting these sort of assets done quickly. You can snap to faces, to vertices, to edges, even to volume, so it goes into the center, which is really useful if you're ever doing fingers on Avatar, because getting that bone in the middle of a finger is really hard. So that's a very, very useful tool to use. Now, even though the edges are a bit, like it doesn't look that good as a model, you would never see that overhang, and just the result is the poly count is more important than how clean it is in areas that you won't see. So I was happy to leave that as is, simply because the poly count saving was quite large. After I've done a bit of a quick unwrap, once again, I'm just doing flat material, so it doesn't have to be all that accurate. It just needs to be sort of to scale. So if I use a tileable texture, I can sort of create that nice effect with that. And just taking the light element a bit further. So in the previous section, like the auditorium itself, the stairs have that light. Continuing that same sort of aspect. The request was sort of like a more futuristic kind of approach to it, so just pushing those ideas that little bit further, just to tie all the spaces in this one overall space together. You'll note here that I'll put sort of like edging on the start or beginning, or what would you call it, on the doorway. It's kind of strange how metaverse spaces or digital spaces kind of have to represent real-world spaces to create that sort of overlap between comfort and the unknown. So finding the overlap between what you're trying to do in a digital space that has absolutely no limitations in regards to what you can do with it, and making something that people are comfortable in as soon as possible, for example, is definitely a key part of experience design. It's kind of an interesting one that I find kind of fun, but also weird in that we have to kind of abide by those rules. But I think the skill comes into how can we break those rules in the process of creating these assets. So it's really quite interesting how that works there. Taking the space into Unity with some of the updates, you'll notice because I changed the object itself, the light mapping will break. And as you know, I like light mapping way too often. So I'm probably just going to skip some of these for this process, just to show that, yeah, I'm still doing that, but I still want to feel how's the light going. So in this first case, for example, you'll note that there's too much light because I don't know the architecture terms, but the LEDs or the light at the top and the bottom is a little bit too much, and therefore it gets too bright. So just tweaking that once that's done, and then having to remap that because you need to see what that looks like, and then continuing on. Next up, we have the light probes, adding those in. You'll notice that I'll start being a little bit more attentive to the light variation. So at the edge, you have more light than you would in the center. So sort of creating those elements of where the light is and the different light probes in those areas. So when your characters are in the area, they'll be lit correctly. Depending on your space, you could definitely use the light probe generator that we have in the Mona library. That does it quite quickly. Not as accurately, so depending on your lighting situation, that might be enough as well. So that's kind of like it's a bit more manual and takes a little bit longer, but the results are that little bit better overall. So notice in the middle of that middle room, there's not that many light probes, but on the edge, the light will change from the edge to the sort of like LEDs, getting dimmer in that section, I guess. So yeah, adding that in there. And as noted, reducing the light LEDs from the walls there just to get that sort of a bit more to the correct levels of light. And then exporting that. And also creating a collider for that asset as well, because that whole asset was changed. Basically making sure that the mesh collider is optimized for all of the elements there and getting rid of those extra polygons. So thinking about the mesh collider as purely where can I run, and then removing everything that doesn't apply to those rules, including all of the LED spaces there as well. A different approach to this could have been creating a mesh collider for the main auditorium, because that has the steps that makes it a little bit more difficult to do that with box colliders, and then using box colliders around these objects for the gallery room and the lobby. That said, these rooms are pretty simple, so there was no real need to go into the whole process of that. So I think this was the quickest approach, and it wouldn't cost that much, so I was happy to continue on with that. That said, it is possible to actually have rotated box colliders. You can't really do that with the component itself, but if you had an empty game object, put the box collider on that and then rotate the game object, that is how you can actually have box colliders at angles. So it's not ideal, but you can definitely do it. With that done and looking pretty good so far, I decided to get on to some of the other elements of this space, such as the spotlights on the stage. Once again, I want to bring attention to that stage. That's the key thing in the auditorium. So trying to sort of balance out the light that the light probes will bring to that. So if any avatars and things are up there, that will be all sort of very clear. And then, of course, updating the canvas size because the ceilings are much higher. That works a lot better as well, because then it'll be easier for people to see the screen up on the wall there as well. So basically balancing out some of the elements with the updates to the model, so you get a better overall experience. I'm not too sure about the lighting on this stage. It looks a little bit too spotlighty, I guess is the short way to say it. So I'll probably come back to that later. But it's a good start. It gets a feeling of sort of what I'm trying to do, but I'm sure there's a better way to do it. So I might look into some reference in regards to how stages are lit a bit better later. Noticing common elements there, once again, bringing the space a bit more to a same theme. So making sure that the lights here, for example, create some light there in that auditorium. So it continues that step element up through the end. It looked a bit separate or a bit disconnected, I guess you could say, to the rest of the auditorium, but even more so with the gallery and the lobby. So making sure that if you have a theme to a space, that theme goes to all of the areas that apply with that. And then once again, just refining those polygons to make sure we get them as low as possible. And it's only a couple here and there, but it's just a good habit to get into that, and I just like doing that, to be honest. I enjoy the optimization. Don't know about you, but I enjoy the optimization. I consider it kind of like problem solving in interesting ways to get the results that we want. Speaking of which, moving on to sort of like the gallery wall, where we can put some images or canvases so people can put their work. I will make one of these, and that way when you use it for Unity, the file size will be a little bit smaller. Now this of course applies in a more real world case where you're creating one asset that is used a lot in a space, so like decoration or other things like that, but in this case we're just doing the wall. So instead of making 2 walls, I make 1 and then copy that in Unity. Another tool that you can use for that is making a prefab. So every copy in Unity will do the same as the original. So prefabs are super useful for optimizing a space, but also updating a space as needed with one asset. So that's a really optimized way for time saving more than anything, but as well as file size of the end result. Playing around with scale just to get a better idea of how big or small I want these sort of things to be. So I get a feel for it in Unity and then go back into Blender to adjust it as needed. I find personally that if I'm going to be doing any scale elements, that I'd like the original to be as up to the final result as anything in regards to getting that into Unity as well. You will find that, say, for example, sometimes if you have the scale off, so you make an asset that's 100 times bigger in Unity and that is using light mapping, the light map size will be a bit off, which of course you can change. There are some settings in the asset, but generally speaking, I'll try to make every single asset 1 to 1 to 1 in order to make sure that there's no warping or scale issues with light mapping or just in general. So one more light mapping, and then we start looking at reflection probes. This allows sort of assets that have metallic textures to have a reflection effect that is not so expensive. It is static, so that that reflection probe doesn't change. But generally, unless you have like a smooth reflection, like a 1-to-1 reflection, then that's more than enough to sort of get by. I will say that I'm not at all happy with the lighting. The blue doesn't really work as well as I'd like. So I might go back to this water white, but it also depends on if I'm going to add color to the walls and things like that. But as it stands, the first hour or two, so this is the second hour, this is more about just the layout and getting a feel for the space and an idea of the lighting. So the next session I'll probably be looking at kind of that effect, like getting the lighting and the wall textures more correct. And then getting into sort of like the secondary pass there. And the last thing before this session finishes up is just making a large canvas, making it unlit. That way the light probes don't affect that light, so it's always bright. And then one more bake before moving on. And before next session, I'll probably get those lights to sort of where I want them rather than like relight mapping because it takes so long, even with the edits. So I'll do that. But I think I'm pretty happy with the layout of the space. I think this room would be quite good for sort of art pieces on the gallery wall. I think I did note that those lights are actually real-time, so I'll have to set those up differently. And yeah, that's the second hour done for this space. And moving on to sort of like a more detailed pass towards sort of more a final approach, now that we know what the layout kind of looks like. So we'll get into that. Thanks for watching.